Cel shading is a rendering technique often used in animation or comics using flat colors as opposed to more painterly or soft shading. Basically, you have a base color, you slap a shadow on top with a hard brush, and maybe you also add a highlight color as well. Except it can be much more than that. A lot of us artists feel like fully shaded artworks have to be something like this or this, and we dismiss cel shading as a middle step to get there, or as a method only used to save time. I'm guilty of this too, but recently I started to get the hang of cel shading. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and to be honest, it can look just as good as my other rendered artworks. So today I'm gonna be sharing my tips and tricks on how to make your cel shading look more interesting. Let me explain my process before we get into some of the tips. The footage I'm using here is from my recent Surprise Me commissions. Let's start out with the line art. My line art is very clean and sharp, but you don't have to have line art to do cel shading. This is just how I like to do it. In fact, you can also do cel shading on a lineless art style if you're one of those people that curse the existence of line art. Point in case, the wings in this drawing are lineless because I didn't want to put too much focus on them. Then I put down flat colors that are all on their own layer so I can adjust them later. I make a new layer to shade the skin and add a mask to it, so the shading only shows up on top of where the base color of the skin is. I do this for pretty much all parts of the character, so I end up having at least 2 layers for each base color / their shadow. So in this case, the skin, the hair, the teeth, the white of the dress, pink of the dress, etc. I recommend doing this unless you already have a color scheme figured out, because each layer of shading is going to affect how the base color looks. Here's an example of the skin being the exact same tone but shaded with warm colors versus with cold colors. If every color and shadow is on its own layer, we can adjust them once we have most of the shadows and highlights placed. I know this is a bit tedious, but I'm gonna talk about why I don't just use a layer mode like multiply to shade everything later on in the video. I promise I don't just want to make more people suffer with me in 500 layer hell. For shading, it's important that you have an understanding of light and shadow in order to make the shadows look convincing, but I wouldn't worry too much about if they are 100% realistic. What's much more important in my opinion is your shape language. You can see me experimenting around with the shape of the chest and collarbone in this area. I decided most of the character's right side is in the shadow because it's gonna draw the eye more to the side that's in the light. Because I don't use a soft brush or blending tool for this, I can't rely on making my shading look interesting with hard and soft edges. So that makes shape language much more important. When you put down a shadow, it describes the form of whatever you're drawing. In this case, boobs. But to a certain extent, you can pick and choose how the shadows are shaped and where you place them. One super important concept regarding shape language is big, medium, small. If you're a seasoned artist or just someone who listens to art videos a lot, you probably heard of this concept before, so I won't go super deep into it. Basically, when you draw shapes, for some reason they just look better together when one of them is big, one is medium, and one is small. This also applies to distances between objects. And you guessed it, it also applies to cel shading. You can see me using this in all different areas of this drawing. The purple parts represent the big shapes, pink is medium shapes, and yellow is small shapes. It's a super valuable technique for art in general, so I recommend learning more about this if you haven't already. Now that we have the base shadows down, let's add more depth with highlights. I don't add these on every color, mainly just the skin, hair, and horns in this case. I recommend placing them where you want the viewer to focus on, aka the face and respectfully guys, respectfully. And of course also on materials that are shiny like metal or nails in this example. The stuff I said about shape language is also important here, so you guys better get that stuff in your heads. Anyways, once the highlights are done, I pick a more desaturated, darker color and put a second shadow layer on top of the skin and hair. This color goes only into areas where I put shadows before. It's basically on the planes of the character that face the furthest away from the line, so they're even darker. Also, a little thing I learned recently, if you do line art, remember that you don't have to line every detail and every edge, because you can still show those details in the shading phase. For example, if this drawing was just meant to be line art, I would have drawn his chin like this, because otherwise it would look a bit awkward, almost like he doesn't really have a chin. But because it's meant to be shaded, I can simply show the shape of the chin with the shadow. That way it looks less rigid. Once I'm happy with the colors of the shadow and highlights, I go in and add some brighter, saturated colors to the edges of the shadows on the skin. This kind of imitates subsurface scattering, but to be honest, sometimes I also add this on materials where it makes no sense. It just looks pretty, there's no need to make it a science. I always make the edges a varying thickness because it looks more interesting to me than if it was all the same thickness. That just looks too mechanical in my opinion. Once I have all of the shading done, I color in my line art. There's many ways to do this, and my method is kind of the sloppy, half-assed way, but it looks good, so I'd say it's sufficient. I make a layer and clip it to my line art. Then I pick a super saturated shade of red and put it on areas of the line art that borders light and warm colors, like the skin or the blonde hair. This gives it a bit of a softer touch and also makes the colors more vibrant. Then I also go in with a saturated blue on areas that are mainly white or gray. You could do this with other colors as well, but I kinda ended up sticking to red and blue because those colors work well with my art. For you it might be other colors, so definitely experiment with it. Alright, let's talk about layer modes. Some of you may be wondering why I go through all of the effort to make separate shadow layers for every color instead of just taking a multiply or hard light layer and slapping it over everything, since that would be much less complicated. When you pick a multiply layer and shade everything with that, it affects every layer in the same way and it ends up making the colors look less interesting in my opinion. This is an example from a previous video where I showed how I rendered this artwork. Basically, every color and every object reflects light differently, and I like having the control to adjust them manually to get really vibrant colors. Here's the artwork with the shadows put in on normal layers, and here's the version that's shaded with only one multiply layer. I also changed the hue and saturation so you guys can see that I didn't just pick an ugly color. That said, you can definitely use layer modes for shading and make it look good, I just don't prefer doing it that way usually. I like to use them to add effects though, which we will talk about later. In the beginning I told you about how you don't really use soft brushes or blending tools with cel shading, so now we're gonna use soft brushes and blending tools. Rules are made to be broken. While I don't use soft brushes to place shadows or highlights in this shading style, I do use them to create bigger gradients in some places. For example, I went with a lighter bluish gray tone on the shadows of the white parts of his dress to make them appear softer and draw less attention away from the face. And of course, you can also use cel shading in combination with other rendering techniques. I have so many artworks that are a weird mix of cel shading and soft shading. There's no need to stick strictly to one. I put a gradient on the red parts of his wings, and I also used a soft brush on some parts of his horns. But the main thing I use them for is actually effects. Once everything is done and figured out, I grab my soft brush again, put a hard light layer on top of everything, even the line art, and add a mask of the character's silhouette. Then I pick out a light blue color and gently airbrush over the parts of the drawing that I want to blend in with the background more. This is gonna make it look as if the background is actually glowing. It also helps to separate his chin and hand from his shoulders so they stand out more. I make the wings a bit blurry using Gaussian blur since they are behind him, and then add some sparkle/dust to add a bit more interest. Last but not least, I add a vignette effect on top to draw the eye towards the center of the artwork. And that's how I make my cel shading look cool. I don't usually make tutorials, but I hope this was helpful to you guys. Leave a like to let me know. I recently made a Blue Sky account to share my art, so follow me there. Thanks for your cool fan art and special thanks to my Patreons. Will out.